All right, good morning, Detroit. Oh, my goodness. I always wanted to do this. I said, good morning, Detroit.
Good morning, Detroit.
Oh,
Luke.
thank you for that.
Luke, you got to hit him with a what up, though.
What up, though, Detroit? Did I do that right? I don't think I did that one right. All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Luke Polcyn. I am the Deputy Group Executive for Jobs and Economy, the City of Detroit. Welcome to Equitable Property Tax Reform for Detroiters. You're in for a treat. We have a great panel here. I'll introduce him and we'll get started. Immediately to the right is Nick Allen. He is a Ph.D. candidate in urban planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Never heard of it.
We call it Mass Tech here.
Mass Tech. Immediately to the right of Nick is Anika Goss, the CEO of Detroit Future City, a treasured local institution. And to the right of Anika is Roderick Hardamon, the CEO of Imprint and the CEO of Development Group, and without question, the best dressed man in this room.
Absolutely.
All right. So a lot of great questions to unpack here. We're going to jump right in. We are, of course, talking about the property tax landscape in the city of Detroit. And there are some challenges we'd like to unpack before we get into what we think might be some of the solutions. So I'll start by asking, what are the challenges we're trying to address with reforming property taxes in Detroit? And I'd ask Rod to kick us off.
Thanks, Luke. So I think to set the stage, it's important to understand what we're really trying and what we're trying to address here. We're trying to just help and solve and support all the individuals, the residences, and the small businesses who have had a chance to hang on and preserve and push our beautiful city forward. There have been many folks that have held on through all the challenges, and we want to make sure that as the resurgence of Detroit continues to take shape, that it is inclusive and equitable, right? Again, we want to make sure it's inclusive and equitable. That means we want to remove barriers for everyone who is passionate about living and investing in the city of Detroit to having impact in the 7.2 or in every individual neighborhood in the city of Detroit.
And so, Anika, I'd ask, what should our community consider when we're designing a new approach to property tax reform?
Yeah, I think what's really exciting about it is that this actually focuses on the whole system, right? We're not just taking it piece by piece. And what we know is that the largest demographic to leave the city of Detroit are middle-class African Americans. And we also know that the number 1 and 2 reason that they leave the city or are saving to move out of the city are taxes and insurance. And the inequities between Detroit and the surrounding suburbs in our property taxes are just demonstrably higher and without real explanation. And so the idea of a Detroit tax, meaning that it just costs more to live here generally, even whether it's property tax, whether it's insurance, whether it's the investment in schools or other amenities, it has to be something that's systemic that we can actually address and not just piecemeal along if we want families to stay.
I think you're exactly right, Anika. And when you think about it, right, it's actually a very personal conversation, right? It's each one of us who either grew up here, own property here, right? For every house or investment you made in your property, it actually costs you more to maintain in the city of Detroit versus any one of the suburbs, right? The same house that you may have in Detroit, right, is cheaper from a dollar-to-dollar basis in the suburbs, but comparatively across the country, right? So it's a very personal decision. And so while all of us in this room may have abilities to figure out how to make that work, just imagine, right? You are a young couple or an older couple, and you're trying to figure out how to make every penny matter. Every extra dollar you have to spend on property tax reform takes away from what you put in your home, the investments you put in your community, the money you spend in small businesses. That's the problem. So it becomes a never-ending cycle of challenge that holds the city back.
And Nick, what do we know about the way in which that tax burden impacts the value of a home and intergenerational wealth creation?
Yeah, well, to put this in really simple terms, right? The more you pay in taxes, the lower values are going to be within that city. And it bears out, what Rod and Anika are talking about. Detroiters' experience of those taxes bears out when you look at other cities across the country. Detroiters pay the highest property tax rate of major U.S. cities and one of the highest tax rates within Southeast Michigan. So you would expect, of course, that property values within the city are depressed because of that high tax rate. And the question is, what do you do about that? How do you transform this landscape and put Detroit in a position where the residents, businesses, and investors in the city are looking at a landscape that looks a lot more like other cities around Detroit and other cities across the country?
And how might we design a solution? I understand you've co-authored a League of Land Institute report that recommends a particular approach, but could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I think about this in two parts. So first of all, if we're going to do anything about property taxes, the first and most important thing is to bring tax relief to residents and businesses throughout the city, to reduce the tax rate citywide, and find a way to make sure that everything, existing businesses and new businesses, are paying a rate that they would get elsewhere. But the other question is, how do you make sure to do that in a fiscally sound way? And you need something to replace those revenues. Well, one option, and the way that we talked about in the Lincoln Institute report, is to replace that with a tax on land value. And there are really three reasons you might want to do that. The first is that a tax on land value, unlike any other tax, does not discourage investment. It doesn't punish you when you put new capital into a building. You don't change the tax bill when you change the amount that you've improved something. The second thing that's really important about a land value tax is that it makes it isn't costless anymore to hold property permanently, right? You can think about a world in which people are asked to put their property into use when it makes sense to do so. And the final thing, and I think this is also really important, is that a land value tax doesn't fall on places that have been historically disinvested. So if you're in a neighborhood where the taxes and other burdens on you have been really strong, your land values are going to be low. And this is not a tax that strongly hits those places at all. And so there's a strong equity dimension to this, especially when you're thinking about neighborhoods across the city.
I want to just emphasize that point, Nick, because as we think about all of the neighborhoods that we really care about, the idea that we would have a tool that would discourage land speculation, land holding, the term land banking, where you're just buying property and sitting on it, waiting for the values to increase, that is really what holds back the value of a lot of the neighborhoods that we are really trying to see revitalization happen. And so I feel like that particular point is something that I think is critical and why it matters for all of us here in Detroit.
Right, and I think that's exactly right, Anika. I mean, you're talking about a change, I think any tax reform is going to have a lot of changes in the short term, but you also have to think about the way that this would change the opportunity structure in every single neighborhood in the city. This is about thinking about the long term and what it would do to have a tax that doesn't discourage people from doing exactly what their neighbors and their communities would want them to do with their property.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because I want to make sure everyone's tracking what the current system is designed to do in terms of sort of calculating value and then taxing accordingly, and what that discourages, and what shifting the property tax, incorporating the land value tax, and enabling a reduced taxation on improvements means. So, for instance, right now, I own a single-family home on the east side of Detroit, and I put on an addition because I want to stay, my family's growing, and I want to stay in my neighborhood. If I do that, the current system would essentially punish me for expanding the investment in my home, or in any event, give the vacant lot owner down the street a free ride and acknowledge my investment and deliver a tax bill that sort of is commensurate to that investment. Is that accurate?
Yeah, let's think about this in terms of one of the projects that was already talked about today, the Bluebird Inn, right? If you put a new roof on the Bluebird Inn, A regular tax bill means that you're going to pay more for having done something to keep your neighborhood up. In a world with a land value tax, that doesn't happen, right? The investment itself doesn't see new taxes because of the land value tax. And the more we can shift a property tax system away from taxing investment and towards thinking about a productive and sustainable tax base that doesn't discourage people from making those investments, the better off Detroit is going to be, and the better off other cities are going to be that would choose to adopt this approach.
So Rod, given the projects that you have going in our treasured neighborhood commercial corridors in particular, tell us a little bit about what this might mean for neighborhood development in particular, particularly given the scale of those developments, the ways in which they have to, under the current system, go through the same processes to sort of secure public co-investment. What does this mean for neighborhood development in particular?
Yeah, and I'll start off with a little anecdote. So when I left New York to come back home, I made the rounds to all my investor friends and my clients. And I said, hey, I'm going back to Detroit. I'm going to do this real estate thing. You love me. We love each other. I gave you great service. Why don't you give me a penny or two to go make investments? And the consistent comment was, we're not willing to bet on Detroit. And the bet was, there wasn't enough certainty in the process. Wasn't certainty on the direction. There wasn't certainty in the tax code. All these uncertainties. What this does, it takes away a significant uncertainty, because if I can predict the value, right, of my building and my project into the future, then people can place a value on that, and then buildings can turn, they can trade, they can sell, right? We have a system now that's built and established that we need a tax abatement to survive. We need tax abatements just to live. The challenge is now the land value tax may not eliminate that completely, but it will reduce the need for these abatements as a permanent survival mechanism. But the second thing is, when you're doing neighborhood projects, oftentimes those projects are not getting these incentives that you may get in larger deals. So if you got a single family, 2-family, 4-family flat, you're not walking downtown for a tax abatement. So you're just stuck with the bill, right? You got a 6-unit, 8-unit, which are a lot of folks, and a lot of our apartment owners and land owners here are actually 2-family owners, 4-family owners, single-family owners. They don't have the luxury, the systems, or even the know-how to get a tax abatement. So they're excluded from that beneficial system. So the land value tax would make it, or this shift would make it a much more equitable system, so it doesn't pick as many winners and losers, because everyone will have an equal shot to benefit just by the benefit of you're willing to invest in a project. And because things become more consistent, people can predict. What's going to happen is the level of investment we see not only from folks inside the city, but from external stakeholders will increase, because they know what's going to happen next. The biggest thing from an investment professional is uncertainty. If I don't know what's going to happen, then I can't make a bet. I can't make an investment. This takes away one of the largest uncertainties we have in the ecosystem and provides certainty, which will unlock capital and access.
And so, Nick, we've talked a lot about how this might make for a more equitable system, but I'd like to dwell on that for a little bit longer. Can you walk us through? You've talked about how this is going to, need to unlock new revenue sources in order to reduce the tax burden on the vast majority of residential property, homeowners in particular. But walk us through a little bit about how all that works and what the impact would be.
Yeah, so first of all, from a fiscal structure perspective, the goal here is to make sure that local governments are still able to provide the same set of services and collect the same revenues. We're not talking about tax relief that doesn't come in with something else. We're just trying to find a better source of revenue that doesn't have the same discouraging effects that it does today on neighborhoods. But I think from an equity standpoint in particular, Rod has hit on one of the most important parts of this, which is that we're thinking about a world in which we are giving existing investments, existing homes, existing business in the city, a treatment much more like the way that we try and treat new capital now. So the goal is comprehensive tax relief and a comprehensive change that would really allow people to unlock the value of assets that are already here. And so when I think about this, I think that the opportunity here is to say, look, we want a tax structure, we want to raise revenue in the city in a way that is matched to the services you are receiving now and doesn't overburden either existing assets or new investments in the city. And that to me is the key to this. Now you can do a lot to make sure everything is stabilized. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that picture looks like fiscally. But I think the overwhelming thing is about the changes on the side of the market and what that will do long term to the city's revenues, to prosperity in the city, to property values in the city, and to shift the picture of development and occupancy, simply staying here and making those costs sustainable.
I'd like to underline something you just said because I think it's so important. It's clear that we have in place the tools we need to incentivize and co-invest in new investments.
Yep.
And we make maximal use of those tools. We've had a lot of success with them, both downtown and in neighborhoods in the last 8 to 10 years. But those tools are not available to existing homeowners, to existing property owners. They are designed only, and they work only because of new investment. So here we have a proposal that would actually, by the sounds of it, restructure the system in such a way as to create new benefits for existing property owners in a way that we can't do with current tools. Is that right? I
think that's really well said, Luke. The overall picture, and I think Anika and Rod know this extremely well, is that there's this absence of additional support for people who have stayed here and built up the city. And this is that support. This is a way to bring down those tax burdens and recognize the effort that people have in simply sustaining what is here, and to think of everybody here today as an investor in the city, whether it's a small business, a light manufacturer, or a single family home, a rental property. Those are all investments too, and they need the same type of encouragement that new investment gets. Now, I do want to emphasize, I think the big risks that big projects take will likely need some additional incentive. There's no city that has moved to this system and gotten completely away from also saying, if you put a big project here, we're going to also think about tax abatements going forward. But I think this is a step towards the equity that we've been talking about for a long time.
So, Anika, I'd love to hear more from you about how you think this proposal would impact sort of the homeowner or renter in the community or other key stakeholders that I know your organization is so actively engaged with. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you think?
Yeah. I think Nick hit that, or maybe it was Rod, about the stability. I think you said that. Having a consistent and stable tax structure and tax changes that are systemic, right, will impact at a whole variety of income levels. And I think what we forget is that it was less than 15 years ago. Not only did we have an entire mortgage crisis with the rest of the country, but the tax foreclosure crisis that wiped out neighborhoods completely, right? This system of actually stabilizing the tax structure, allowing for a much more equitable, understandable process, that is what we're trying to get to. So that we don't have to have Band-Aid programs, as Nick described, of only poverty exemptions that are managing tax burdens, or some sort of abatement that you may or may not qualify, depending on what neighborhood you live in. There will be a consistent, systemic tax structure that actually takes the value of the land that your house is on and allows for you to reinvest and grow your own wealth right there in your neighborhood, and reducing this idea of tax foreclosure and reducing this idea of renter eviction. A number of the landlords that are managing, as Rod said, that are managing properties are these 2 and 4 and single family. That's the majority of the landlords here in Detroit. And the majority of those landlords can't afford those properties. And so oftentimes renters are at the subject of those landlords and find themselves evicted, not because they didn't pay the rent, because the landlord has been foreclosed on for taxes. So finding a solution to that can be permanent, that can be actually implemented in a way that is equitable and that impacts a number of stakeholders in Detroit should be the goal. That's what we should all be working towards.
So you said 2 things in your answer that I'd love to unpack a little bit more. Really amazing insights. So you mentioned benefiting from abatements by virtue of the neighborhood you live in. So we have a neighborhood enterprise zone program that covers a number of neighborhoods in the city. What do we know about the effectiveness of that program on neighborhood stability, redevelopment, property values, and what can that teach us about what the benefit of a tax reduction in other neighborhoods might lead in terms of stabilization and assessed value increases or at least resale value increases, I should say.
Yeah, I'd love to take that one, Luke. So I think there's about 30 neighborhoods in the city right now. It's about 15% of the city's land area that qualifies for this program called the Neighborhood Enterprise Zone program that was put in place just before the Great Recession. And there's a really remarkable study of this that I gotta share, which is that not only did putting those tax abatements in place reduce the tax burden in those places and raise the values of property in a way that stabilized them like no other cities, like no other neighborhoods made it through the Great Recession. It also created so much value that there was no revenue loss. And that's kind of a remarkable thing, right? That people's values were lifted enough that they made it through in a completely different way. The mortgage market stayed relatively intact in those neighborhoods, and there was no actual fiscal loss to the city. When you look at it today, about 75% of mortgage originations in Detroit happen in those neighborhoods. And I think the question is, how do we get those mortgage originations everywhere else?
Exactly.
Well, you do it by putting tax relief into all those other neighborhoods too.
So the other thing that Anika underlined is the benefit for renters and how the economics of landlord enterprises operate on razor-thin margins that don't really position them for reinvestment in the properties. Rod, I think you brought it up earlier. Would you like to say a little bit more about what we think this might mean in terms of sort of economic relief for the tenant and landlord system?
No, sure. I think it's quite simple. Everyone wants to run a good business. Everyone wants to improve the value of things they own. So every dollar we unlock in tax relief actually lets it go back into the buildings. It actually lets them provide a better, safer, more stable product for the communities they live in. As they do every building that they have, then more folks want to come into those neighborhoods. You attract greater tenants. People like quality. I've always found as a developer, it's always a flight to quality. People assume economic income status determines your ability to maintain or want for quality. That is not the case. If you provide someone a quality product, it doesn't matter how much money they make. People take care of it because why? Everyone wants to live well, live comfortably, be safe, and be secure. So every time we unlock a dollar for these landlords and these holders of single family, 2 families, 4 families, 6 families, they'll put that money will trickle back into the buildings. Those businesses improve. That means we're providing safer, more stable, affordable housing in most cases across the city. So by unlocking the tax dollar here, we're actually helping potentially solve another problem, allowing more stable and safer, affordable housing throughout the city of Detroit.
So we unfortunately only have a little time left, but I'd like to. This is a conference about downtown. I would like to take a moment to talk about what we alluded to earlier as sort of a fiscal cliff that a lot of developments face after their tax abatements expire. How would sort of mitigating that fiscal cliff benefit downtown development?
So I want to come back to the point that Rod raised about 10 minutes ago, which is that when you create a system that it completely depends on tax abatements, and that is the strategy that has led development in downtown and midtown, you create a huge amount of uncertainty at the end of those abatements. And the question is, how do we make that picture more financially sustainable, not just for residents of the city, but also for everybody who has put risk capital into downtown and midtown Detroit? And so this is an opportunity to think about what does it look like to turn the corner after those abatements burn off. We've done an amazing job in the city of Detroit over the last 15 years, putting in a huge amount of new investment and new opportunity into downtown and midtown. But we also need a plan to stabilize those investments in the long term and to make sure that people coming in at this point feel that same level of certainty and stability about what happens next.
So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't look at everyone and say we have an excellent investment environment. We're just trying to make it better. All right, 20 seconds remaining. What would be the next steps for implementing a proposal like this? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the community education around this, because it is a tax policy, right? So that taxes are hard and people are afraid of taxes. And it also sounds like we've had a lot of schemes that went sideways in Detroit over the years. And so helping people to understand what exactly this is, I think helping people to understand why we should be supporting it at every level is really, really important. I think Nick does a great job of breaking down what the policy is, but I really feel like not enough of us really understand what's happening and how to really get the word out.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Anika, for those final words. Nick, Anika, Rod, thank you for everything. Thanks to everyone in this room.
Awesome.